Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The English Globe. I hope you all are well. And today we begin a very important and powerful conversation about a situation that is developing in one of the most sensitive and strategic regions of the world. A situation that connects global politics, energy security, and international cooperation in a way that can influence not only governments and leaders, but also ordinary people across different countries. And I want you to imagine something clearly for a moment. Imagine a narrow waterway where a large part of the world's oil passes every single day, where even a small disruption can increase prices, create uncertainty, and raise tensions between powerful nations. And now imagine that countries are being asked to send their military forces there, but many of them are saying no. And that is exactly what we are going to explore today in our topic. Trump's appeal denied. U.S. allies refuse naval deployment in Hormuz.
That introduction already shows how serious and complex this situation is, Adam, because many people may hear the name Strait of Hormuz and not fully understand its importance. But in reality, this is one of the most critical energy routes in the entire world. A place where geography and global economics meet in a very sensitive balance, and whenever tension increases in this region, it immediately attracts attention from governments, markets, and international organizations, because the flow of energy through this narrow passage supports industries, transportation, and daily life in many countries. And when that flow feels uncertain, the effects can spread very quickly across the global system.
Before we go deeper into this discussion, we kindly invite all our dear listeners to support the English Globe by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comment section below, because your engagement helps us continue creating meaningful and educational content for English learners around the world. And we would also love to know where you are listening from and what you think about today's topic, because this is a global issue, and hearing different perspectives from different countries makes the conversation more interesting, more balanced, and more valuable for everyone who is trying to understand the world in a clear and thoughtful way.
Now let us gently move into the heart of today's topic and understand why this development is so important at this moment, because we are not only talking about a request made by a political figure, but also about the response from allied countries who decided not to participate in a proposed military deployment. And this decision reflects deeper questions about trust, strategy, risk, and international cooperation. Because when allies do not agree on a security issue, it shows that global politics is not always simple or unified, and that each country must carefully consider its own priorities, its own risks, and its own responsibilities before making such serious decisions.
In simple terms, the situation we are discussing today involves a call for increased naval presence in the Strait of Hormuz, a region that has seen periods of tension in the past, and the idea behind such a request is usually to protect shipping routes, ensure safe movement of energy supplies, and reduce the risk of conflict or disruption. But what makes this situation unique is that several allied countries have chosen not to join this effort, and that decision raises important questions about global cooperation, about how countries see risk differently, and about how modern alliances are evolving in a world that is becoming more complex and less predictable.
It is also important to understand that this topic is not only about military decisions, but also about economic stability and global confidence. Because when countries hesitate to take part in joint actions, markets may react, analysts may become concerned, and people may begin to wonder what this means for the future of international cooperation. And this is why discussions like this are important for learners as well. Because understanding global events helps you not only improve your English listening skills, but also develop awareness about how the world works, how decisions are made, and how different factors like politics, economics, and security are connected in real life.
Another important point to remember is that situations like this are rarely simple or one-sided, because every country involved has its own perspective, its own strategy, and its own concerns. And while one country may see military presence as a form of protection and stability, another country may see it as a risk of escalation or unnecessary involvement. And this difference in thinking is a natural part of international relations, where decisions are often based on careful calculation, long-term planning, and sometimes even domestic political pressures that influence how leaders respond to global challenges.
As we continue this podcast, we will carefully explore all these aspects step by step in a clear and simple way, so that our listeners can understand not only what is happening, but also why it is happening and what it might mean for the future. And we will talk about the importance of the Strait of Hormuz, the details of the request that was made, the reasons behind the response from allied countries, and the possible impact on global politics and energy markets. Because learning becomes more powerful when we connect information with real-world situations that are shaping our present and our future.
In the next parts of this discussion, you will see how geography can influence global decisions, how energy routes can become points of tension, and how alliances can be tested when countries face difficult choices. And we will keep our language simple, clear, and structured so that English learners can follow comfortably while also gaining valuable knowledge about international affairs. Because here on the English Globe, our goal is not only to teach language, but also to build awareness, confidence, and critical thinking through meaningful and engaging conversations.
So, dear listeners, take a moment to focus, listen carefully, and think about how a single waterway can connect so many countries, so many interests, and so many decisions. Because today's topic is not only about one request or one response, but about a larger picture of how our world works, how nations interact, and how even a narrow stretch of water can become a powerful symbol of global cooperation, disagreement, and change. And by the end of this podcast, you will have a clearer understanding of why this situation matters and why it deserves attention from anyone who wants to understand today's world in a deeper and more informed way.
This podcast is created for educational purposes and English learning, and we encourage you to stay with us throughout this discussion, share your ideas, and think critically about what you hear. Because understanding global events is not about choosing sides, but about learning, analyzing, and growing step by step. And now let us begin this journey together as we explore one of the most important and sensitive developments in today's international landscape. When we begin to understand the Strait of Hormuz, the first thing we must look at is its geography. Because this narrow waterway is located between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, with Iran on one side and countries like Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. And even though it may appear small on the map, its position makes it one of the most important connections between oil-producing regions and global markets, which means that ships carrying energy resources must pass through this exact route to reach different parts of the world.
I completely agree with you, Adam, because what makes this strait truly powerful is not just its location, but its function in global transportation, especially when we talk about oil and natural gas, since a significant portion of the world's energy supply moves through this narrow passage every single day. And this creates a situation where many countries depend on the stability of this one route to maintain their economic activities and meet their energy needs.
Another important detail is how narrow the Strait of Hormuz actually is at certain points, because in some areas it is only a few kilometers wide for shipping lanes, which means that large oil tankers must travel carefully and follow specific paths. And this limited space increases the importance of safety and security, since even a small disruption or accident can affect the flow of multiple ships and create delays that may quickly spread across the global supply chain.
Yes, and that is exactly why this region receives so much attention from governments and international organizations, because when such a large amount of energy passes through a narrow and sensitive area, it naturally becomes a point of concern. And I think it is important for our listeners to understand that this is not just about geography, but about dependency, because many economies rely on this steady flow of energy to keep industries running and daily life functioning smoothly.
If we look at the numbers, experts often say that around 1/5 of the world's total oil consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and that is an enormous share when we think about global demand, because it means that a significant part of the world's energy system is connected to this single route. And this is why any news related to this area immediately attracts global attention and analysis.
I agree with that point, Adam, and I would also add that this dependency is not limited to nearby countries, because even nations that are far away from the Middle East can feel the impact if something changes in the Strait of Hormuz, since oil prices are part of a global market. And when supply feels uncertain, prices can rise quickly, affecting transportation, production, and even food costs in different regions.
This brings us to another important idea, which is how quickly global markets react to any tension in this area, because investors and analysts closely monitor the situation, and even a small increase in risk can lead to immediate changes in oil prices, stock markets, and economic forecasts. And this shows how deeply connected the modern world is, where a local issue can have global consequences within a very short time.
That is a very important point, and I strongly agree, because in today's interconnected economy, confidence plays a major role. And when there is uncertainty about a key energy route like the Strait of Hormuz, markets often respond not only to actual events, but also to the possibility of disruption, which means that even before anything happens physically, the fear of instability can already influence economic decisions and planning.
We should also consider the role of shipping and trade beyond oil, because while energy resources are the main focus, this route also supports broader maritime activity, and maintaining safe passage is important for international trade as a whole, which further increases the strategic importance of this narrow waterway in global discussions.
Yes, and this is why many countries view stability in this region as a shared interest, even if they do not always agree on how to achieve it, because the consequences of disruption are not limited to one country or one region, but can affect global systems in a wide and complex way. And that is why decisions related to this strait often involve careful consideration and international dialogue.
So, when we connect all these points together, we can clearly see that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographical feature, but a key part of the global economic system, where location, energy, and international relations come together, and understanding this helps us better analyze why decisions related to this region are taken so seriously by world leaders.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, this understanding is very valuable because it allows you to see beyond the headlines and recognize the deeper reasons behind global events. And when you understand how something like the Strait of Hormuz works, you begin to understand how the world is connected, how decisions are made, and why even a narrow passage of water can have such a powerful influence on global stability and everyday life.
To clearly understand the current situation, we must carefully look at what exactly was requested, because the discussion is not only about a general concern, but about a specific appeal directed toward allied nations. And in simple terms, the request was for greater international support in the form of naval deployment in the Strait of Hormuz, meaning that friendly countries would send their military ships to help monitor the area, protect commercial vessels, and ensure that this critical waterway remains open and secure for global trade.
Yes, Adam and I agree that it is important to focus on clarity here, because when people hear about naval deployment, they may imagine conflict, but the stated purpose of such a request is usually connected to security and protection, where naval forces are used as a presence to discourage potential threats, provide safety for oil tankers and cargo ships, and maintain confidence among global markets that the flow of energy will continue without interruption.
Another important part of this appeal is that it was not intended to be a single country effort, but rather a coordinated action involving multiple allies, because when several countries participate together, it creates a sense of shared responsibility and collective strength, which can be more effective in maintaining stability compared to one nation acting alone, especially in a region where tensions can quickly become sensitive and complex.
I completely agree with that point, because multinational cooperation in such situations is often seen as a way to reduce the burden on any single country while also showing unity among partners. And it can send a message that the international community is working together to protect important global interests, particularly when it comes to vital trade routes that many economies depend on.
At the same time, the request also reflects concerns about possible risks to shipping routes, because the Strait of Hormuz has experienced periods of tension in the past, and any uncertainty in this area raises questions about the safety of vessels passing through it, which is why increasing naval presence is often viewed as a precautionary step to prevent disruptions before they happen rather than reacting after a problem occurs.
That is a very important observation, Adam, and I would add that these concerns are not always about immediate threats, but also about long-term stability, because when shipping companies, energy producers, and governments feel uncertain about a key route, they may start making adjustments that can affect supply chains and prices, so maintaining a visible and stable security presence can help reduce that uncertainty.
The strategic reasoning behind this type of appeal is also connected to deterrence, which means that the presence of multiple naval forces can discourage any actions that might threaten the safety of the route, because when potential risks see that there is strong and coordinated monitoring, they may be less likely to take actions that could increase tension or create disruption in such a sensitive area.
Yes, and I agree that deterrence plays a major role in this situation because in international relations, the goal is often to prevent problems before they start, and a cooperative naval presence can act as a signal of readiness and stability rather than aggression, especially when it is presented as a protective measure rather than an offensive one.
It is also important to understand that this appeal comes at a time when global energy demand remains high, and many countries are still heavily dependent on oil shipments passing through this region, which means that any risk to this route becomes a global concern, not just a regional one. And that is why such requests are framed as matters of international importance rather than national interest alone.
I agree with that perspective because when we look at the bigger picture, we see that energy security is closely linked to economic stability, and countries often cooperate in areas where their interests overlap, even if they have differences in other areas. And this makes the idea of multinational involvement both logical and necessary in certain situations.
However, even though the request may seem reasonable from a strategic point of view, it is also important to recognize that each country evaluates such appeals differently, based on its own priorities, risks, and political considerations, which means that agreeing to send naval forces is not a simple decision, but one that involves careful analysis and planning at multiple levels.
That is absolutely true, and I strongly agree, because participation in such operations can involve costs, responsibilities, and potential risks. And governments must consider how their involvement might affect their own national interests, their relationships with other countries, and their long-term strategies in the region.
So when we bring all these elements together, we can see that the request for naval deployment was not just about sending ships, but about building a coordinated effort to protect a vital global route, manage risks, and maintain confidence in the international system, which is why it has received so much attention and discussion.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, understanding this helps clarify that behind every headline, there are deeper layers of strategy, cooperation, and decision-making. And when we take the time to explore these layers, we gain a clearer and more balanced understanding of global events, which is the goal of our discussion here on the English Globe.
When we carefully examine why several U.S. allies chose not to participate in the proposed naval deployment in the Strait of Hormuz, we begin to see that this decision is not based on a single reason, but rather a combination of strategic thinking, political caution, and national priorities. Because each country must evaluate not only the immediate purpose of such a mission, but also its long-term consequences. And many governments may have concluded that joining a military presence in such a sensitive region could create more risks than benefits, especially at a time when global tensions are already high and unpredictable.
I completely agree with that perspective, Adam, because political hesitation plays a very important role in decisions like this, and leaders often need to consider how their actions will be viewed by their own citizens, their political institutions, and their regional partners. Since sending naval forces to a tense area is not only a military decision, but also a political message. And if that message is not clearly supported at home, it can create internal debates, criticism, and pressure that governments may prefer to avoid in order to maintain stability within their own countries.
Another key reason behind this refusal can be linked to concerns about escalation, Because even if the intention of deploying naval forces is to protect shipping routes and ensure stability, there is always a possibility that increased military presence could lead to misunderstandings, accidental encounters, or rising tensions with other regional actors. And many allied countries may have decided that avoiding such risks is more beneficial than participating in an operation that could unintentionally increase instability in an already delicate environment.
Yes, and I strongly agree that the fear of escalation is a major factor here, because history has shown that in regions where multiple interests are involved, even small actions can sometimes lead to larger consequences, and governments are often very careful about entering situations where control is limited and outcomes are uncertain, especially when diplomacy and dialogue are still possible alternatives that can help manage tensions without increasing the military presence in the area.
We should also consider the differences in foreign policy strategies among allied countries, because while some nations may prioritize a strong security presence and believe in deterrence through visibility, others may focus more on diplomatic engagement, economic cooperation, and long-term negotiation. And these different approaches can lead to different decisions when it comes to participating in joint operations, even if all countries share a common interest in maintaining stability in the region.
That is an important point, Adam. And I agree that these differences reflect how each country sees its role in the international system, because some governments prefer to take a cautious and balanced approach, where they avoid actions that could be interpreted as taking sides, while others may be more willing to participate in security operations. And this diversity in strategy shows that alliances are not always uniform in their responses, but rather flexible and influenced by individual perspectives.
In addition to strategic differences, domestic priorities also play a significant role in shaping these decisions, because governments must often focus on issues within their own countries, such as economic challenges, public services, and political stability. And when resources are limited, leaders may choose to prioritize internal needs over external commitments, especially when those commitments involve potential risks and uncertain outcomes.
I fully agree, because domestic considerations are often one of the most powerful influences on foreign policy decisions, and leaders must balance international responsibilities with the expectations of their citizens, who may not always support involvement in distant regions, particularly if they do not see a direct impact on their own lives. And this creates a situation where governments must carefully justify their actions and ensure that their decisions align with both national interests and public opinion.
Another aspect to consider is the idea of strategic independence, where some allied countries prefer to maintain a certain level of autonomy in their decisions, rather than automatically supporting every initiative proposed by another nation. And this does not necessarily mean disagreement or conflict, but rather a reflection of how modern alliances operate, where cooperation exists alongside independent decision-making.
Yes, and I think this highlights the complexity of international relations, because alliances today are not simply about following a single direction, but about coordination and dialogue between partners who may have different priorities and perspectives. And this makes the decision-making process more nuanced, as countries try to find a balance between cooperation and independence in a rapidly changing global environment.
It is also worth noting that some countries may believe that alternative approaches, such as diplomatic discussions or regional cooperation, could be more effective in addressing the situation than increasing military presence. And this belief can influence their decision to decline participation, as they may prefer solutions that focus on communication and de-escalation rather than deterrence alone.
I agree with that idea, because in many cases long-term stability is achieved through dialogue and understanding, rather than force. And while security measures can play an important role, they are often most effective when combined with diplomatic efforts that address the root causes of tension. And this balanced approach is something that many countries aim to achieve in their foreign policies.
When we look at all these factors together, it becomes clear that the decision by U.S. allies to refuse participation is not a simple rejection, but a carefully considered choice influenced by multiple layers of analysis, including risk assessment, political realities, strategic priorities, and global context, which shows how complex and thoughtful international decision-making can be.
Exactly, Adam. And this is why it is important for our listeners to understand that global events are rarely about right or wrong decisions, but about different perspectives and priorities coming together in a complex system. And by exploring these reasons in detail, we can develop a deeper and more balanced understanding of how countries interact, cooperate, and sometimes choose different paths in the pursuit of stability and security.
When we begin to understand the role of Iran in this situation, it is essential to first look at geography and recognize how its location places it in a highly strategic position along the northern side of the Strait of Hormuz, which means that Iran is physically very close to one of the most important energy routes in the world. And because of this proximity, any development in or around the strait naturally involves Iran as a key regional actor, not only because of its geographic presence, but also because of its influence over nearby waters, shipping awareness, and regional dynamics, which makes its role central in discussions about security, stability, and the movement of global energy supplies through this narrow but extremely significant passage.
I agree with that explanation, Adam, because geography alone already explains why Iran is such an important part of this situation. But beyond geography, there is also a long history of complex relations between Iran and several Western countries. And these relationships have experienced periods of tension as well as moments of negotiation, which means that current developments cannot be understood without recognizing this broader context, where political disagreements, economic sanctions, and security concerns have shaped how different countries interact with Iran, and how Iran responds to actions or proposals that involve its surrounding region.
Another important aspect to consider is that Iran, like any country, has its own national interests and security concerns, especially in a region that is already sensitive and strategically important. And this means that any increase in foreign military presence near its borders or along nearby waterways may be viewed with caution, not necessarily as an immediate threat, but as a development that requires careful observation and response, because countries often react based on how they interpret actions around them, and this interpretation can influence the overall atmosphere in the region.
Yes, and I strongly agree that perception plays a major role in international relations, because even when actions are presented as protective or defensive, different countries may understand them differently based on their own experiences and strategic thinking. And this is why communication and clarity are so important, since misunderstandings can sometimes increase tension, while open dialogue can help reduce uncertainty and build a more stable environment for all parties involved.
We should also remember that the Strait of Hormuz is not just important for global energy markets, but also for regional countries, including Iran, because it is closely connected to their economic activities, trade routes, and overall stability, which means that maintaining a balance between security and openness is in the interest of multiple actors in the region. And this shared interest creates both opportunities for cooperation and challenges in managing differences.
That is a very important point, Adam. And I agree that shared interests can sometimes create space for cooperation, even when there are disagreements in other areas, because countries often recognize that stability in key regions benefits everyone. And this understanding can lead to efforts to manage tensions through diplomatic channels rather than allowing situations to escalate unnecessarily.
When we talk about tensions between Iran and Western countries, it is important to approach the topic carefully and focus on widely known dynamics rather than speculation, because these tensions are influenced by a variety of factors, including political disagreements, economic policies, and differing views on regional security. And while these issues can create challenges, they also highlight the importance of ongoing dialogue and negotiation as tools for managing complex relationships.
I completely agree, because focusing on balanced and factual understanding helps us avoid oversimplifying the situation. And it reminds us that international relations are rarely black and white, but instead involve multiple perspectives that must be considered carefully, especially when discussing sensitive regions where decisions can have wide-reaching consequences.
Another key element in this discussion is the balance between military presence and diplomatic efforts, Because while some countries may see security measures as necessary to protect important routes, others may emphasize the role of diplomacy in reducing tension and building long-term stability. And this difference in approach can shape how countries respond to developments in the region and how they interact with Iran as a regional actor.
Yes, and I strongly believe that diplomacy plays a crucial role in situations like this because long-term stability often depends on communication, understanding, and negotiation rather than force alone. And while security measures can provide short-term reassurance, they are most effective when combined with efforts to address underlying concerns and build trust between different parties.
At the same time, it is also important to recognize that countries may use a combination of both approaches, where security presence and diplomatic engagement work together to manage risks and maintain stability. And this balanced strategy reflects the complexity of the situation, where no single solution is enough to address all challenges.
I agree with that balanced view because it shows that international relations require flexibility and careful planning, where countries must adjust their strategies based on changing conditions and new developments. And this adaptability is essential in regions like the Strait of Hormuz, where small changes can have significant impacts.
When we bring all these points together, we can see that Iran's role in this situation is shaped by geography, history, and strategic interests. And understanding these factors helps us better analyze why the region remains sensitive and why decisions related to it require careful consideration from all sides involved.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, this understanding is valuable because it allows you to see the bigger picture without focusing on one side only. And it helps you develop a more thoughtful and informed perspective about how global events unfold, especially in regions where geography, politics, and economics come together in such a powerful and complex way.
When we begin to connect this situation to the global economy, one of the most important things to understand is how sensitive oil prices are to instability, especially in a region as critical as the Strait of Hormuz, because global energy markets are built not only on current supply and demand, but also on expectations about the future. And whenever there is even a small sign of tension, uncertainty, or possible disruption in a key route, traders and investors react quickly by adjusting prices, often increasing them as a precaution. Which means that even before any actual interruption happens, the fear of risk alone can start to influence the cost of energy across the world.
I strongly agree with that explanation, Adam, because many people may think that oil prices only change when something physically stops the flow of energy. But in reality, the global market reacts much earlier based on information, analysis, and expectations. And this is why news about political tension, military movement, or diplomatic disagreement in the Middle East can immediately appear in financial markets, creating a chain reaction that affects not only energy companies, but also transportation, manufacturing, and even everyday consumer goods.
Another important factor to consider is how deeply the world still depends on energy resources coming from the Middle East, because this region holds some of the largest oil reserves, and many countries rely on imports from this area to support their industries, power their transportation systems, and maintain economic growth, which means that stability in this region is directly connected to stability in global markets, and any concern about supply can quickly influence decisions made by governments, businesses, and financial institutions.
Yes, and I completely agree that this dependency is what makes the situation so globally significant, because even countries that are geographically far from the Strait of Hormuz are still economically connected to it through energy markets. And when oil prices rise due to tension in this region, those increases are often felt worldwide, affecting fuel prices, electricity costs, and the overall cost of living, which shows how interconnected the modern global economy has become.
We should also understand that oil is not just a product but a foundation for many other industries, because it is used in transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and even the production of everyday items. And this means that when oil prices increase, the cost of producing and transporting goods also increases, which can lead to higher prices for consumers, creating a ripple effect that moves through the entire economic system.
That is a very important point, Adam, and I agree that this ripple effect is what makes energy markets so powerful. because a change in one sector can influence many others. And this is why governments pay close attention to energy security, as it directly impacts economic stability, inflation, and public confidence, especially during times of uncertainty when people are already concerned about their financial situation.
Another key idea is that markets often react not only to actual events, but also to the possibility of future developments, which means that even small tensions or unclear situations can create large economic reactions, because investors prefer to act early rather than wait for confirmation. And this behavior can sometimes increase volatility, where prices move up and down quickly based on new information or changing expectations.
I strongly agree with that observation, because uncertainty itself can become a powerful force in the market. And when there is limited information or unclear outcomes, people tend to make cautious decisions, which can amplify price movements and create instability even without a physical disruption in supply. And this shows how psychological factors and market confidence play an important role alongside real-world events.
We should also consider how governments respond to rising energy prices, because higher costs can create pressure on economies, especially in countries that rely heavily on imported energy. And in such situations, governments may need to adjust policies, provide support to consumers, or explore alternative energy sources, which shows how a regional issue can influence national decisions in many different parts of the world.
Yes, and I agree that this highlights the importance of long-term planning, because countries are increasingly looking for ways to reduce their dependence on a single region by investing in renewable energy, diversifying supply sources, and improving energy efficiency. But despite these efforts, the global system is still closely linked to traditional energy routes like the Strait of Hormuz, which means that developments there continue to have a strong impact.
Another important aspect is the role of global trade, because energy is essential for moving goods across countries. And when fuel costs increase, transportation becomes more expensive, which can slow down trade and affect supply chains, leading to delays and higher costs for businesses and consumers alike. And this shows how energy markets are deeply connected to the broader global economy.
I completely agree. And this is why even small changes in energy prices can have wide effects, because they influence everything from shipping and logistics to production and retail. And this interconnected system means that no country is completely isolated from what happens in key energy regions, making global awareness and cooperation more important than ever.
When we bring all these points together, it becomes clear that the Strait of Hormuz is not only a strategic location, but also a critical part of the global economic system, where stability supports growth and uncertainty creates challenges. And understanding this connection helps us see why decisions related to this region receive so much attention from leaders, businesses, and analysts around the world.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, this understanding is very valuable because it shows how global events are connected to everyday life and how something happening in a distant region can influence prices, opportunities, and decisions in different countries. And by learning about these connections, you are not only improving your English, but also developing a deeper awareness of how the world works in a complex and interconnected way.
When we begin to analyze the situation in the Strait of Hormuz from the perspective of military strategy, one of the first concepts to understand is naval deterrence, which is essentially the idea that the presence of military forces, particularly naval vessels, in a sensitive region can discourage potential threats or aggressive actions, because the visibility of capable ships signals readiness and strength, which can influence the calculations of other actors in the region, and even the knowledge that multiple allied forces are monitoring key shipping lanes can make it less likely for conflicts or disruptive actions to occur, because potential aggressors may perceive the risks as too high compared to any potential gain.
I completely agree with that perspective, Adam, but it is also important to recognize that while naval deterrence can create a sense of security, it is not the only approach to managing complex international situations, because diplomacy and negotiations offer alternative paths that focus on dialogue, communication, and problem-solving, rather than the display of force. And these tools can sometimes be even more effective in reducing tension because they address underlying disagreements and create opportunities for compromise, mutual understanding, and trust building, which military presence alone cannot always achieve.
Yes, and from a strategic point of view, the main advantage of naval deterrence is its immediacy. Because the physical presence of ships, surveillance capabilities, and rapid response potential can provide short-term reassurance to commercial operators and governments that the area is being actively monitored. And this can help prevent sudden disruptions, protect energy shipments, and maintain confidence in global markets. But at the same time, it comes with significant costs, both financial and political, because deploying forces requires resources, planning, and coordination, and it may also increase the perception of threat among regional actors.
I agree with that assessment, Adam, and I would add that the main strength of diplomatic solutions is their long-term sustainability, because through negotiation, dialogue, and multilateral agreements, countries can create mechanisms for conflict prevention that reduce the likelihood of confrontation, build trust between parties, and provide a framework for resolving future disagreements. And this approach, while slower and often requiring patience, can reduce risks of accidental escalation and support stable relationships that are beneficial for all sides involved, particularly in a region as sensitive and economically critical as the Strait of Hormuz.
Another important factor to consider is the psychological effect of military presence, because while it can deter aggression, it may also increase anxiety or tension if other regional actors interpret it as an aggressive posture rather than a protective measure. And this is why decisions about naval deployments must be accompanied by clear communication and coordination, so that allies, regional partners, and even neutral parties understand the intentions behind the action. And this careful explanation can help prevent misunderstandings that could otherwise escalate into larger conflicts.
Exactly, Adam. And this highlights why diplomacy remains so important, because dialogue allows countries to clarify intentions, negotiate terms, and manage perceptions, which can reduce the risk of misinterpretation that is common in high-stakes situations. And it also provides a platform where disagreements can be addressed without immediate recourse to force, which aligns with the broader goal of peaceful conflict resolution and long-term stability in international relations, especially when energy, trade, and security are all closely linked.
It is also worth mentioning that both strategies, military deterrence and diplomacy, have complementary roles, because in many cases, the presence of naval forces can create a sense of security that supports diplomatic negotiations by showing seriousness and readiness, while diplomacy can set the stage for reducing tensions and avoiding the need for extended military involvement, which demonstrates that combining approaches strategically can be more effective than relying solely on one method.
I fully agree, and in fact, successful conflict management often relies on a careful balance between these approaches, where visible readiness reassures allies and markets, while negotiation, communication, and compromise address the underlying issues. Because relying exclusively on military power can sometimes provoke resistance, increase suspicion, or even escalate conflicts. Whereas relying solely on diplomacy without any enforcement mechanism may not always provide the credibility needed to influence behavior in sensitive regions.
Another advantage of naval deterrence is that it provides flexibility, because deployed forces can observe, gather intelligence, and respond quickly to incidents, which is particularly important in areas where events can unfold rapidly, and having a tangible presence gives policymakers options to act if necessary, while also signaling commitment to protecting key trade routes and global energy interests. But this flexibility comes with responsibility, as any misstep or misunderstanding can escalate tensions, which is why careful coordination and communication are essential.
I completely agree with that, Adam, and I think the main strength of diplomatic engagement is its focus on problem-solving and relationship building. Because when countries engage in structured negotiations, they can identify shared interests, reduce misperceptions, and establish agreements that guide behavior over time. And this method emphasizes prevention over reaction, long-term cooperation over short-term advantage, and peaceful resolution over confrontation, which are essential principles for sustainable global stability.
It is also important to consider costs and risks associated with both strategies, because while naval deployments are expensive, require significant resources, and may create political challenges domestically. Diplomatic initiatives require patience, time, and skilled negotiation, and may not always yield immediate results, which means that decision-makers must carefully weigh which combination of approaches best serves both national and global interests, particularly in regions that are economically and strategically critical like the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, and I strongly believe that emphasizing peaceful conflict resolution as a priority is essential. Because while military presence can prevent immediate threats, long-term stability is achieved only when countries address differences through understanding, communication, and cooperative mechanisms. And this principle aligns with international norms, reduces risks of escalation, and promotes confidence among all stakeholders, showing that global priorities extend beyond short-term security to include sustainable, peaceful, and mutually beneficial outcomes.
When we look at the overall picture, it is clear that the situation in the Strait of Hormuz requires both careful military planning and thoughtful diplomatic engagement, because the stakes are high, the region is sensitive, and the potential consequences affect not only the countries directly involved but also global markets, energy security, and international relations. And understanding these dual approaches helps our listeners see why decisions are rarely simple and why leaders must carefully balance multiple considerations in making choices.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, this comparison between military strategy and diplomacy provides an important lesson about global problem-solving, because it demonstrates that effective international relations often require a combination of readiness, intelligence, communication, and patience. And by examining these approaches in detail, we can develop a clearer understanding of how countries manage tension, protect interests, and pursue peace in regions where stability is critical for the well-being of millions of people and the functioning of the global economy.
When we begin to examine the broader implications of the refusal by U.S. allies to participate in the naval deployment in the Strait of Hormuz, it becomes immediately clear that this decision is not just about a single event, but rather reflects larger trends in international relations and the evolving nature of global alliances. Because alliances are no longer static or guaranteed, simply because countries have long-standing partnerships. Instead, they are dynamic systems in which each member continuously evaluates its national interests, strategic priorities, and domestic pressures before making decisions. And this careful calculation demonstrates that even close allies may choose independent paths when they believe it better serves their long-term security, political stability, or economic interests, which challenges traditional assumptions about automatic alignment in critical geopolitical situations.
I completely agree with that observation, Adam, because one of the key lessons here is that countries increasingly act based on a combination of trust, pragmatism, and self-interest. And even though they may share historical ties, security agreements, or economic partnerships, these relationships are constantly tested by real-world pressures, including regional tensions, resource dependencies, domestic opinion, and political calculations. And this is why it is not surprising to see nations make decisions that appear independent or cautious from the outside, but in reality are the result of careful consideration aimed at balancing multiple competing priorities in an unpredictable international environment.
Another important aspect to consider is the role of trust in alliances, because while trust is often considered a foundation of international cooperation, it is constantly reinforced or challenged by actions, communication, and the credibility of partners. And when a key ally decides not to participate in a joint operation, it may not necessarily indicate a breakdown of trust, but rather a nuanced judgment that aligns with its national strategy, showing that modern alliances require flexibility, patience, and ongoing dialogue to maintain cohesion while respecting the autonomy of individual members.
Yes, Adam and I strongly agree that autonomy within alliances is crucial, because countries have unique domestic circumstances, political climates, and strategic interests. And while shared objectives may exist, each nation must assess the risks, costs, and benefits of participation, especially in situations involving sensitive regions like the Strait of Hormuz, where a single miscalculation could have economic, political, and even military consequences. And this independence does not necessarily weaken the alliance, but can instead reflect a pragmatic approach to balancing commitment with caution.
We should also consider how cooperation is maintained even when countries make different decisions, because alliances are not just about unanimous action, but about communication, coordination, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. And this capacity to work together while respecting individual choices is what allows alliances to remain functional over long periods, especially in an era where global challenges are complex and multifaceted, and decisions about military or strategic involvement cannot always be uniform without creating internal conflict or overextension of resources.
I agree completely, Adam. And another factor is that strategic interests often differ between allies depending on geography, economic exposure, or regional influence, meaning that what may be a priority for one country may not hold the same urgency for another, and this variation in priorities can lead to different responses to the same situation, highlighting the importance of negotiation, compromise, and alignment of goals without assuming identical behavior, because global alliances are inherently composed of diverse nations with unique considerations.
It is also important to recognize that decisions like this reflect broader shifts in global power dynamics, because the traditional dominance of certain actors is increasingly being balanced by the rise of new economic and political players who influence regional stability, energy security, and trade flows. And as power becomes more distributed across multiple states, alliances must adapt to a more multipolar world, where coordination is more challenging but also more necessary, and where each decision sends signals not only to immediate partners, but also to the wider international community about how nations perceive their role and priorities in maintaining global order.
Exactly, Adam. And I would add that the refusal of some allies to participate in the naval mission illustrates that global cooperation is evolving, because countries are demonstrating that they will act independently when necessary while still engaging in dialogue and partnership when it aligns with their interests, which shows that modern alliances are less about rigid hierarchy and more about negotiation, shared objectives, and a recognition that power and influence are not concentrated in a single actor, but are distributed across multiple states with varying capacities and strategic approaches.
Another aspect to consider is the symbolic message sent by such decisions, because even when nations choose not to participate, they may still express support for broader objectives, signaling that commitment to shared values or long-term goals remains intact even if immediate action differs. And this nuanced form of engagement demonstrates the sophistication of modern alliances, where trust, communication, and shared understanding can compensate for differences in tactical decisions while preserving strategic cohesion across complex international relationships.
I fully agree, Adam. And this demonstrates that alliances today are built not only on uniform actions, but also on mutual respect for the priorities and limitations of each member, because understanding and accommodating these differences strengthens relationships over time, reduces the risk of misunderstandings, and allows countries to engage collaboratively on multiple fronts, even when they diverge on specific operational decisions, which ultimately promotes stability and resilience within the alliance system.
It is also worth highlighting that this situation shows the increasing importance of regional dynamics in shaping global alliances, because decisions regarding areas like the Strait of Hormuz are influenced not just by global strategy, but also by local geopolitics, energy dependencies, and historical context, meaning that alliances must now account for both global and regional factors simultaneously, and that balancing these complex layers of interest requires diplomacy, flexibility, and the capacity to act independently when needed.
Yes, and I would emphasize that this evolving approach also encourages dialogue and innovation in international cooperation, because nations are learning to negotiate participation, share responsibilities, and coordinate objectives without assuming complete alignment. And this flexibility allows alliances to remain functional even when global conditions change rapidly, which is increasingly important in an interconnected and unpredictable world where traditional assumptions about loyalty, obligation, and hierarchy may no longer apply.
When we put all these points together, it becomes clear that the decision by some U.S. allies to refuse naval deployment in the Strait of Hormuz is not a simple yes or no situation, but a reflection of how international relationships, trust, strategic interests, and global power balances are evolving. And understanding this complexity allows us to see that alliances today are as much about negotiation and adaptability as they are about formal agreements and shared objectives.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, this analysis highlights the importance of thinking beyond headlines, because global alliances are living systems shaped by trust, cooperation, strategic interests, and the flexibility to respond to evolving circumstances. And by understanding these dynamics, we can better appreciate why countries act independently at times, how global power structures are changing, and why careful, informed analysis is essential to understanding the decisions and behaviors that shape our interconnected world today.
When we begin to think about the possible outcomes of the current situation in the Strait of Hormuz, it is essential to understand that multiple scenarios could unfold, and each one carries different implications for international relations, global markets, and regional stability. Because while we cannot predict the future with certainty, it is useful to consider realistic possibilities such as de-escalation through diplomatic dialogue, continued tension with heightened military awareness, or structured negotiations that involve multiple actors working together to reduce risk. And by analyzing these scenarios carefully, we can better prepare ourselves to understand news developments, government decisions, and market reactions as they happen.
I completely agree with that approach, Adam, because uncertainty is a defining feature of global politics, and even seemingly small events can shift the balance of stability or create new challenges, which means that instead of trying to guess which specific outcome will occur, it is more practical and educational to focus on a range of possibilities. Consider the factors that influence each scenario, and understand how actions by one country or region can ripple through global systems, affecting trade, diplomacy, energy security, and alliances in ways that may not be immediately visible but are critical over time.
One possible scenario is de-escalation, where tensions gradually decrease as countries engage in dialogue, clarify intentions, and take measures to avoid miscommunication. And in such a scenario, the Strait of Hormuz could remain open and stable. Global energy markets could continue operating with minimal disruption, and international partnerships may even strengthen as nations demonstrate their ability to manage crises cooperatively. But achieving this outcome requires patience, trust, and effective communication. And while it is desirable, it also depends on the willingness of all parties to prioritize stability over short-term strategic advantage.
Yes, Adam, and another possibility is continued tension, where uncertainty remains high and countries maintain heightened awareness without direct confrontation, which can create a climate of caution across multiple sectors, including shipping, energy production, and regional trade. And this scenario emphasizes how even in the absence of direct conflict, instability can influence economic decisions, policy planning, and diplomatic relations, showing that global systems are sensitive to perception and risk as much as to concrete events, and that vigilance and strategic planning are crucial under such conditions.
We could also see negotiation as a structured and collaborative scenario, where multiple stakeholders come together to agree on shared procedures for security, monitoring, and dispute resolution, without requiring permanent military deployments or aggressive posturing. And this approach highlights the potential for cooperative problem-solving, as it allows countries to manage risks while maintaining open channels for communication, reducing misunderstandings, and providing a framework for addressing future disagreements before they escalate into crises, which is often the most sustainable path toward long-term regional stability.
I agree, Adam, and it is important to emphasize that even in scenarios where cooperation is attempted, uncertainty will remain, because global politics is inherently unpredictable, and factors such as domestic political changes, economic pressures, or shifts in alliances can influence how countries act. meaning that no scenario is entirely guaranteed, and continuous observation and informed analysis are necessary for both policymakers and the public to understand the evolving situation and its potential consequences.
Another aspect to consider is how regional actors outside the immediate Strait of Hormuz, as well as global powers, may respond differently in each scenario, because their actions will influence the behavior of all parties involved, create pressures for decision-making, and affect the international environment in ways that are complex and interdependent. Which is why thinking about multiple possibilities helps us recognize that every outcome is shaped not just by one decision, but by a chain of reactions that are connected globally, highlighting the interconnected nature of modern geopolitics.
Yes, and this is why understanding possibilities rather than attempting precise predictions is so important for learners and viewers, because it develops critical thinking skills, encourages observation of real-world dynamics, and allows us to see patterns and relationships that are not always obvious. And by following multiple potential outcomes, we can better appreciate how actions, responses, and decisions at the regional level resonate across global systems, influencing energy prices, trade flows, and diplomatic relations simultaneously.
We should also highlight that these scenarios demonstrate the balance between risk and opportunity, because even in tense situations, there are chances for constructive engagement, dialogue, and strengthened international norms. And understanding this dual nature helps viewers see that global politics is not only about conflict or threat, but also about the ability of countries to manage uncertainty, make informed decisions, and pursue cooperation even under difficult circumstances, which is a critical lesson for anyone trying to understand international affairs.
I completely agree, Adam. And I would add that following developments carefully is a key takeaway for our listeners, because by observing news, official statements, and credible analyses, we can understand how different scenarios evolve, how countries respond to shifting circumstances, and how global systems adapt to new information. And this practice of careful observation encourages thoughtful learning, reduces misunderstanding, and allows viewers to connect what they see in headlines to deeper systemic dynamics in international relations.
Another perspective is that by considering multiple scenarios, listeners can develop an appreciation for the complexity of decision-making, because leaders must weigh strategic, political, and economic consequences simultaneously, and the choices made in one context may affect opportunities or risks in another, which demonstrates why countries sometimes act cautiously, defer participation, or prioritize negotiation over immediate action. And understanding this thought process provides valuable insight into how global diplomacy functions in practice.
Exactly, Adam. And this also shows that global events are not isolated, because even distant countries feel the ripple effects of decisions made in strategic regions like the Strait of Hormuz, influencing energy markets, alliances, and long-term planning. And by analyzing multiple possible outcomes, listeners can develop a more nuanced perspective, connecting local actions to global consequences and cultivating an informed and responsible approach to understanding international affairs, which is especially important for English learners who want to engage with current events in a meaningful way.
When we summarize this section, it becomes clear that focusing on possible scenarios encourages careful thinking rather than speculation, because we explore de-escalation, continued tension, negotiation, and the various implications of each without assuming certainty, and by considering multiple angles, listeners can see how complex, interconnected, and delicate global events really are, and why it is important to remain informed, follow developments, and analyze information critically to understand the evolving nature of international relations.
Yes, Adam. And for our listeners, the key message is that understanding possibilities helps you think critically, make sense of news, and recognize the factors shaping the world today, because global politics is rarely straightforward. And by considering multiple outcomes, we can develop both awareness and insight, which are essential skills for learners who want to engage thoughtfully with current events, global affairs, and the international decisions that affect lives and economies around the world.
As we bring our discussion to a close, it is important to reflect on the key lessons from the situation surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, because even though this waterway is narrow, measuring only a few dozen miles across at its narrowest point, its influence stretches far beyond its physical dimensions, affecting global energy markets, trade routes, and international relations. And one of the most important takeaways is how geography can shape politics, because the location of strategic choke points like this creates natural advantages and responsibilities for the countries surrounding them, influences foreign policy decisions, and forces nations to consider both immediate security and long-term economic stability when engaging with regional partners or making strategic choices.
I completely agree, Adam, and I would add that understanding the significance of such regions is essential not just for policymakers or analysts, but for anyone who wants to make sense of global events, because the Strait of Hormuz is a vivid example of how local geography can produce global consequences. And it reminds us that seemingly distant developments, like naval decisions, diplomatic negotiations, or political hesitation, can have direct effects on economies, energy prices, and international alliances, which is why being aware of these connections is so valuable for viewers who wish to see the bigger picture rather than isolated headlines.
Another critical lesson is the central role of energy routes in shaping decision-making, because the flow of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz connects producing countries in the Middle East with importing nations across Asia, Europe, and the Americas, and even a minor disruption or perceived threat to these routes can create immediate reactions in markets, influence investment strategies, and prompt governments to adjust policies, which demonstrates that economic considerations are inseparable from strategic calculations, and that understanding global energy dependence is essential for interpreting the motivations and choices of both regional and international actors.
I fully agree, Adam. And I think it is also important to note that while energy and geography are highly influential, cooperation between nations is never guaranteed, because alliances are dynamic and constantly evolving based on national interests, domestic pressures, strategic priorities, and historical relationships. And this refusal by certain US allies to participate in a naval mission is a clear example of how even long-standing partnerships may be tested when complex regional issues arise, which teaches us that international relations require constant negotiation, trust-building, and awareness of multiple perspectives in order to maintain stability and avoid misunderstandings.
Yes, and we can also observe that decisions made by individual countries are rarely based on a single factor. Rather, they are influenced by a combination of domestic political considerations, economic needs, risk assessment, and broader strategic objectives. And this complexity reminds us that global events are interconnected, that a decision in one corner of the world can ripple across continents, and that understanding these layers helps us interpret the reasoning behind actions, reactions, and policy statements without oversimplifying the situation or assigning blame unnecessarily.
Exactly, Adam. And this emphasizes the value of taking a broad, informed view of global events, because when learners and viewers understand the multiple factors influencing decisions, geography, energy dependence, alliances, domestic priorities, and diplomatic strategy, they are better equipped to think critically, analyze news thoughtfully, and appreciate that international relations are rarely straightforward, and that knowledge and awareness are powerful tools for interpreting current affairs in a nuanced and informed way.
Another lesson to highlight is how tension in a localized region can produce global consequences. Because the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz means that actions taken by one country or responses by another are felt far beyond the immediate area, influencing energy markets, trade flows, diplomatic negotiations, and even domestic policy in nations thousands of miles away, which teaches us that understanding the interplay between regional events and global outcomes is essential for anyone seeking to follow international news, grasp economic trends, or comprehend the rationale behind policy decisions in a connected world.
I strongly agree, Adam. And I would add that for English learners, this situation provides a meaningful example of how language, analysis, and context combine to create understanding, because by following discussions about geography, strategy, energy, and diplomacy, learners are exposed to real-world topics in accessible English, which enhances comprehension, vocabulary, and critical thinking simultaneously. And it also shows that learning English is not just about grammar or words. It is about engaging with the world, understanding complex ideas, and developing the skills to interpret information responsibly.
It is also important to reflect on the delicate balance between military strategy and diplomatic engagement, because the Strait of Hormuz situation demonstrates that security measures, naval presence, and strategic readiness are often paired with negotiation, dialogue, and confidence building. And this combination illustrates that effective international policy relies on both preparation for risks and the pursuit of peaceful solutions, which is an essential principle for understanding modern geopolitics, where both deterrence and diplomacy must coexist to maintain stability and prevent escalation.
Yes, Adam. And this situation also reminds us that uncertainty is a permanent feature of international relations, because even with careful planning, intelligence, and strategic decision-making, countries cannot fully control outcomes, and the best we can do is monitor developments carefully, think critically about possible scenarios, and understand the logic behind decisions, which reinforces the importance of staying informed, cultivating analytical skills, and appreciating the complexity of global affairs, rather than reacting impulsively or oversimplifying the story.
Another takeaway is that energy dependence, geography, and alliances all intersect to create a network of influence that can amplify small actions into global reactions. Because the interconnectedness of modern trade, finance, and diplomacy means that any tension along key routes like the Strait of Hormuz will reverberate across multiple systems, affecting not only policymakers and traders, but also ordinary citizens who experience changes in fuel prices, shipping costs, and broader economic conditions. And understanding this network helps us see the world as an interdependent system where local events are never isolated.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, the key message is that learning to follow these developments with attention, curiosity, and critical thinking is invaluable, because it allows you to connect cause and effect, recognize patterns, and interpret global news with a deeper awareness. And by combining knowledge about geography, energy, alliances, and strategy, you are not only improving your English skills, but also developing the ability to think like an informed global citizen who understands how regional actions can shape the world economy and international relations.
In conclusion, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz teaches us that a narrow waterway can have a global impact, that strategic geography and energy dependence are intertwined with politics, that cooperation is often complicated and not guaranteed, and that understanding these connections requires attention, reflection, and continuous learning. And by keeping these lessons in mind, we can follow future developments with a sense of awareness and responsibility, recognizing the importance of staying informed and thinking critically about events that shape our interconnected world.
Yes, Adam. And as we wrap up this podcast, we want our listeners to remember that every development in international affairs is part of a larger picture. And by observing carefully, analyzing thoughtfully, and engaging critically, you can not only improve your English, but also gain insight into how global politics, economics, and strategy influence everyday life, which is the ultimate goal of this podcast: to educate, inform, and empower our audience to navigate the world with knowledge, curiosity, and understanding.